Hello, everyone. So I decided to do my research project on George Creel and the gendered propaganda of World War I. This is for Dr. Fink's History 3242 class. So, when I started researching World War I thought it was all about the battles, but then I discovered George Creel and the Committee on Public Information, and I was hooked immediately. Creel wasn't fighting this war with guns. He was fighting with posters, speeches, and ideas. And while doing this, he was shaping how Americans saw the war. What really excites me is how he used ideas about manhood, strength, and duty to rally a divided nation. It's not just about propaganda. It's about how Creel tapped into what it meant to be a man in 1917, playing on fears and dreams to get people behind the war. I'm passionate about this because it shows how powerful words and images can be, especially when they're tied to something as personal as identity. In this presentation, I'll share my findings on how Creel's CPI worked and what it reveals about masculinity and gender in wartime America. So it was these ideas that led me to specific questions which guided my research. I came up with a few big questions. First, how did George Creel and the CPI use propaganda to shape American opinions during World War I? Second, how did they lean on masculinity, gender, and even sexuality to make their messages stick? And finally, what do Creel's own writings and the CPI's materials tell us about his beliefs about manhood and how he used cultural fears to push the war effort? These questions kept me focused on gender and sexuality, the core themes of our course, while letting me also explore Creel's role as a propaganda mastermind. So to answer these questions, let's look at the context of America in 1917. In April 1917, America jumped into World War I, but the country was a mess, divided, skeptical, and not exactly eager to fight in a war far away. The U.S. was diverse, with a weak central government and lots of people who didn't trust the military. President Woodrow Wilson knew he needed everyone on board, so he created the CPI through Executive Order number 2594. Just days after Congress declared war, and he picked George Creel to run it, and he was originally a journalist from Kansas City with a fire for progressive causes. Creel was Wilson's guy because he'd already shown his loyalty. In 1916, he wrote Wilson and the Issues, a book defending Wilson's first term, proving he could sell big ideas to the public. Wilson trusted him to do something huge, turn a fractured nation into a united war machine without crushing democracy. Creel saw this as his patriotic mission, calling it, quote, a fight for the minds of men, end quote, to spread the, quote, gospel of Americanism, end quote, across the globe. His words give me chills. They're intense, like he saw himself as a warrior for ideas. The CPI's job was massive. They had to get men to enlist, convince people to buy war bonds, save food, and even hate Germany, all while keeping America's democratic spirit alive. Creel faced a tough crowd. Americans valued their freedom to think differently, which made building what he called a war will, a shared drive to win, really hard. To pull it off, the CPI used everything they had: posters, pamphlets, films, and the 4 Minutemen, a team of 75,000 volunteers who gave short speeches at theaters and gatherings, reaching 130 million people with over 7.5 million talks. I'm amazed at how they turned a quick break between movie reels into a chance to fire up the crowd for war. Creel didn't want to look like a censor, though. He pushed for voluntary censorship, where newspapers followed CPI guidelines out of patriotism, avoiding strict laws. He believed in expression, not suppression, using journalists' sense of duty to shape the news. But the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917, which led to 1,000 convictions for anti-war talk, gave him backup. silencing critics. It's a bit unnerving to think about Creel walking this tightrope between freedom and control, but it shows how seriously he took his role. What grabbed me the most was how Creel's propaganda wasn't just about facts, it was about feelings, especially about what it meant to be a man in 1917 America. Posters like "Beat Back the Hun" showed heroic soldiers protecting women and children from savage Germans, making men feel their honor was at stake. This wasn't random. It tapped into cultural ideas about masculinity, and I'll explore this in the next coming slides. Now that I've set the stage with Creel's role and the CPI's mission, let's dive into the heart of my research, how Creel's propaganda used ideas about masculinity, gender, and sexuality to rally Americans behind the war. I'm fascinated by how Creel didn't just sell a war, he sold a vision of what it meant to be a man. His posters and speeches tapped into deep cultural feelings about strength, duty, and honor, but also fears of weakness and shame. To me, this is where the story gets interesting because it shows how propaganda wasn't just about convincing people, it was about shaping their identities in a time of crisis. The CPI's propaganda leaned heavily on what scholars call the soldier-hero ideal, a vision of men as brave, chivalrous protectors of a nation. This wasn't just an American idea, it was huge across the Western world during World War I. Anna Card Coyne explains how British culture tied masculinity to the chivalrous warrior, a figure celebrated in books and films as the ultimate man. Creel brought this idea to America, using it to make military service feel like a test of manhood. Posters from the CPI's division of pictorial publicity, like "Beat Back the Hun" with Liberty Bonds, showed American soldiers as strong and noble, standing tall against barbaric Germans. These images screamed, "Real men fight, real men protect." But it wasn't just about heroism. The CPI played on what R.W. Connell calls the hegemonic masculinity, the idea that there's one right way to be a man rooted in strength and dominance. Creel's rhetoric, like calling the CPI's work a fight for the minds of men, framed propaganda itself as a masculine battle, urging men to prove their worth by enlisting or buying bonds. I see this as Creel tapping into a cultural pressure cooker. Men were told they had to kill to prove that they weren't weak or worse, feminine. It's powerful, and it worked. 10 million men registered for the draft in 1917 with no major protests thanks to the CPI's messaging. What really strikes me is how Creel used fear and shame to push men into action. Posters like Joseph Pennell's showing Liberty Island under attack with the caption, "Buy Liberty Bonds or you will see this," weren't just about raising money. They were about making men feel like failures if they didn't act. The subtext was clear. If you don't buy bonds, you're letting down your family, your country, and your manhood. This tapped into what Card Coyne calls a crisis of masculinity during World War I, where the war's brutal machinery like shell shock and wounds made men question their strength. Shell shock, seen as a masculine complaint akin to female hysteria, was a cultural nightmare, suggesting men could break under pressure. Creel's propaganda countered this by doubling down on images of unbreakable, heroic men, avoiding any hint of weakness. The CPI also played on men's roles as protectors, especially of women and children. Posters and 4-Minutemen speeches painted Germans as Huns with blood on their bayonets, implying they'd ravage American homes if men didn't step up. Creel himself wrote about highlighting German atrocities, like the sinking of the Lusitania, to stir up outrage. This wasn't just about fear, it was about chivalry. Men were told they had to defend women's purity and the nation's honor, tying their masculinity to patriotic action. Sarah Price's work on World War I posters shows how this worked. Enlistment was framed as a male initiation rite, where men had to prove they weren't soft by joining the fight. Here's where things get even more interesting. The CPI's propaganda wasn't just about rigid masculinity. It sometimes blurred gender lines. Price's research on posters like "Oh Boy, That's a Girl" point out how some images showed soldiers with soft, almost feminine features. This androgyny was a paradox. While the CPI pushed a hyper-masculine ideal, some posters softened soldiers' images to make them more relatable or appealing. Price argues this reinforced and deconstructed gender norms, catching men in a confusing space between strength and vulnerability. To me, this shows how propaganda could be flexible, using whatever worked to pull men in. Sexuality also played a subtle but powerful role. While the sources don't directly mention explicit sexual imagery, the Hun stereotype carried sexual undertones. Maxwell notes that posters depicted Germans as threats to women, hinting at sexual violence to outrage men. Card and Coin's work adds context. World War I culture was obsessed with protecting women's purity, and propaganda used this to motivate men. Creel's focus on German culture as savage and immoral contrasted with American men as moral protectors, reinforcing heteronormative masculinity. But Card and Coin also points out the war's topsy-turvy gender dynamics, where gay or fluid identities in military spaces like cross-dressing in trench theater challenged norms. The CPI, I think, avoided these ambiguities, sticking to clear-cut images of men as straight, strong defenders to keep things simple and urgent. One thing that really gets me is what Creel's propaganda didn't show, the reality of war's toll. Card and Coin's research on wounded soldiers shows how injuries were a cultural shock, seen as passive or effeminate, because they left men helpless. Facial wounds like those in Henry Tonk's medical illustrations were especially devastating, stripping away the heroic image of manhood. Yet, CPI posters never showed this. Instead, they focused on what Card and Coin calls unconquerable manhood, like British war memorials that ignored trauma to glorify sacrifice. Creel's own words back this up. He called the CPI's work, quote, open and positive, end quote, avoiding anything that might dampen the war spirit. By hiding wounds and shell shock, the CPI kept the masculine ideal shiny and untouchable, but at a cost. Men were sold a fantasy that didn't match the mud and blood of the trenches. This omission wasn't just about keeping morale high, it was about controlling the narrative. Card and Coin notes that wounds could be badges of honor for some men, but for others, they meant lost identity and status. Creel's propaganda ignored these struggles, focusing on action and victory to drown out fears of emasculation. The 4 Minutemen, for example, spoke of the justice of our cause and the need for men to act, never mentioning the risk of disability. I see this as Creel betting on hope over reality, using masculine pride to mask the war's darker truths. As I dug into George Creel's story, I found myself captivated by the man behind the propaganda. Who was he, and why did he pour so much effort into shaping America's wartime mindset? Creel wasn't just a journalist. He was a passionate progressive, a loyal Wilson supporter, and someone who saw himself as a patriot fighting for a cause. His book, How We Advertised America, reveals a man who believed he was on a mission to unite a nation, calling it a fight for the minds of men and a chance to spread the gospel of Americanism. To me, this passion feels almost like a soldier's zeal, but it's rooted in words and images, not weapons. Creel's background as a muckraker, fighting for women's suffrage and child labor reforms, shows he cared about justice, but his loyalty to Wilson drove him to see the CPI as his patriotic duty. Chloe Maxwell describes him as naive at times, so caught up in Wilson's vision that he might have missed the darker sides of his propaganda, like how it silenced dissent. Yeah, I see strength in his choices too. He rejected harsh censorship laws, pushing for voluntary censorship to keep the press on his side, trusting in journalist patriotism, a move that, proves confidence in his ability to persuade. His decision to save CPI records even after Congress cut funding, which shows a man who's desperate to protect his legacy. and prove that he was honorable and effective. It's like he saw himself as a father figure, guiding America through World War I with a firm but moral hand. What really gets me is how Creel's own sense of masculinity shaped his work. His rhetoric, phrases like conquest of convictions and creating a war will, mirrors the wartime ideal of men as dominant and decisive. Anna Cardin Coyne's work helped me to understand this. World War I culture celebrated the soldier hero, a chivalrous protector, and Creel seemed to embody this in his leadership, framing his propaganda as a battle for honor. But there's a flip side. Stephen Trout pointed out that propaganda like Creel's painted soldiers as knightly figures, setting up expectations that left veterans feeling betrayed when society ignored their struggles. I think Creel's blind spot was his idealism. He believed so deeply in the noble cause that he didn't see how his glorified images might hurt the men who couldn't live up to them. So, what does this all tell us? My research leads me to a clear thesis. George Creel's CPI propaganda harnessed World War I soldier hero ideal and cultural anxieties about masculinity to unify American support, using gendered imagery to reinforce traditional roles and mobilize men while ignoring the war's traumatic realities, which left veterans alienated. The evidence is compelling. CPI posters like Beat Back the Hun and the 4 Minutemen speeches pushed men to enlist or buy bonds by tying masculinity to duty and protection, shaming those who hesitated. Sarah Price shows how these images framed war as a male initiation rite, making enlistment a test of manhood. Michael Kimmel adds that this self-made man ideal, rooted in sacrifice, pressured men to conform but clashed with the post-war reality of trauma and neglect. Cardin Coyne's insight seals the deal. The war's crisis of masculinity, from shell shock to wounds seen as effeminate, created fears that Creel's propaganda countered with heroic, unbreakable men. But by hiding the truth, wounds, disability, emotional pain, the CPI set veterans up for a fall. Trout's research shows how veterans felt adrift when the knightly image didn't match their mud-blood reality, leading to alienation. Creel's own words emphasizing open and positive messaging reveal his choice to avoid these harsh truths, keeping the masculine ideal untarnished. Reflecting on this, I'm struck by the power and the cost of Creel's work. His propaganda unified a nation, no doubt. 10 million men registered for the draft, and millions bought bonds. But at what price? By selling a dream of heroic manhood, Creel left veterans grappling with a society that celebrated myths but ignored their pain. To me, this is a lesson in how words and images can shape who we are, but also how they can betray us when they hide the truth. Creel's story isn't just about World War I. It's about the weight of expectations we place on men and how those expectations can both inspire and break them. To bring my thesis to life, I wanted to dive into a source that was closer to the time period I was studying, specifically a secondary source, and I came across a thesis by a man named Paul Watson Keller titled The 4 Minutemen, and it captured the CPI's propaganda through speeches and bulletins. So, I first found in his thesis a 1919 poem, quote, it's called the Part of the 4 Minutemen, end quote, by Fred A. Worth. It declares, quote, I am a soldier, I fight German propaganda, intrigue, falsehoods, treachery. I am a preacher, using the text that all men are equal. I invoke loyalty, patriotism, devotion, end quote. This poem encompasses everything that I found in my research. It paints the 4 Minutemen as a warrior priest, a masculine ideal straight out of Creel's playbook. Chloe Maxwell notes that CPI campaigns framed men as defenders against the Huns, tapping into chivalrous duty. The poem's heroic language, calling speakers soldiers and mouthpieces of democracy, mirrors Anna Coyne's soldier-hero archetype, urging men to prove manhood through patriotic sacrifice. The next source I found in this thesis was a 4-Minute Men speech pushing the Second Liberty Loan. It says, quote, "To those who drowned our women and children, we shall hurl back our answer. $1 billion a week to win. Every dollar you lend your country now will mean a saving of American blood," end quote. This speech weaponizes masculinity. And the third source that I found in this thesis was a 1918 speech titled "Maintaining Morals and Morale." And it goes like this, quote, "We Americans feel that those boys drilling and carrying heavy bags, digging trenches, preparing for the great task, to them we owe everything, everything, everything." This speech grabbed me specifically because it exalts soldiers as masculine heroes, yet it focuses on their spirit and soul, not their suffering. Maxwell highlights how the CPI avoided hymns of hate, but this speech sidesteps trauma as well. Coyne notes that ignoring shell shock reinforced masculine ideals, branding weakness unmanly. By urging civilians to support soldiers' morale, it fuels the heroic myth my thesis critiques, hiding the war's toll and contributing to the veteran alienation. These sources, a poem, a bond speech, and a morale speech, show Creel's CPI at work, hammering masculine ideals to unify America. The poem casts speakers as heroic soldiers, the Liberty Loan speech demands men protect families, and the morale speech glorifies soldier sacrifice while all ignoring trauma. They prove how CPI propaganda harnessed gender to mobilize men, but left veterans stranded when the soldier-hero myth collapsed. I'm amazed at how Keller's sources exposed both the CPI's power and its blind spots. I hope you all enjoyed my presentation, and thank you again for listening.